The night sky over New Mexico had always been clear, and Karen Bishop knew every star by heart after 15 years of watching them through the observatory telescopes. She sat in her usual chair at the Deep Space Observation Center, sipping cold coffee and reviewing the data streams from the satellite network, when something appeared on her screen that made her heart stop. The readings showed an energy signature forming in Earth's orbit, and it was massive. And it was growing, and it defied every known law of physics she had ever studied. Karen grabbed her phone and called her supervisor, but the words came out in a jumble of technical terms and panic. Within minutes, the entire facility was awake and crowded around her workstation, watching as the energy signature solidified into something physical. The vessel that materialized was enormous and sleek and covered in a material that seemed to absorb and reflect light at the same time. It just hung there in orbit, making no moves and sending no signals, and the silence was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. By morning, every government on Earth knew about the ship, and military forces were mobilizing, and the news networks were running non-stop coverage with wild speculation about alien invasion. Karen found herself pulled into emergency video conferences with officials from a dozen countries, all demanding answers she did not have. The ship remained silent, and when attempts were made to communicate using every frequency and language known to humanity, there was no response at all. Lieutenant Commander Paul Grant was aboard the International Space Station. When the orders came through, he was told to observe the vessel and report any changes, and under no circumstances was he to approach it without direct authorization. Paul floated to the observation window with his crew and stared at the ship that hung in the darkness like a sleeping giant. It was beautiful, in a way that made him uneasy, because nothing humanity had built looked anything like that, and the technology required to create it was beyond their comprehension. 3 days passed with the ship doing nothing, and the world below was tearing itself apart with fear and speculation. Religious leaders declared it a sign of the end times, and scientists argued about whether the visitors were hostile or peaceful, and governments prepared for war while hoping for peace. Karen barely slept during those 3 days as she monitored every sensor and detector, trying to understand what the ship was made of and how it had appeared from nowhere. On the 4th day, the ship finally spoke, and the message came through every communication device on Earth simultaneously. Phones and radios and televisions and computers all delivered the same words in perfect English and Chinese and Spanish and Arabic and every other language spoken by humanity. The voice was calm and clear, and somehow both male and female at once. "We are not invaders. We are your descendants. We have come home." The world stopped. Karen stared at her computer screen where the message scrolled in text form while the voice continued to repeat it. Paul heard it through the station's communication system and looked at his crewmates, who were all frozen in disbelief. Below on Earth, billions of people heard the same impossible claim and tried to process what it meant. The message continued with a request for a meeting with representatives from all nations at a neutral location. The visitors chose the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone who understood what the vault represented. It was a storage facility for plant seeds from around the world, meant to preserve genetic diversity in case of global catastrophe, and now beings claiming to be future humans wanted to meet there. Karen was selected for the delegation, along with Claire Morrison, who was a diplomat known for her skill in difficult negotiations, and Dr. Nathan Cole, who was a biologist specializing in human evolution, and Colonel Lisa Martinez, who was there to assess any military threat. The 4 of them flew to Norway on a military transport and barely spoke during the journey, because what could anyone say about meeting people from the future? The Svalbard Vault was located deep in a mountain, and the entrance was a stark concrete structure jutting from the snow. When the delegation arrived, they found the vault doors already open and a soft blue light emanating from within. Karen felt her hands trembling as they walked down the tunnel carved through permafrost and ice. The vault's interior had been transformed, and instead of shelves of seeds, there was now an empty chamber with 3 figures standing in the center. The beings looked human, but not quite right. They were tall, and their skin had a faint luminescent quality that shifted between colors. Their eyes were larger than normal and held a depth that made Karen feel like they could see through her into her very thoughts. They wore simple clothing that seemed to be woven from light itself, and they stood perfectly still watching the delegation. Approached the tallest of the 3, stepped forward, and spoke in that same dual voice. From the broadcast, she introduced herself as Arya and gestured to her companions as Kellen and Guy. Zane. They were humans from the year 4000. Ad and they had traveled back. Through time using technology that would take hours to explain. They had not come to conquer or guide, but to reveal a truth that humanity needed to know before it was too late. Claire found her diplomatic voice and asked what truth they meant. Arya's expression became serious, and she activated a device on her wrist. Suddenly, images flooded into Karen's mind, not through her eyes, but directly into her consciousness. She saw Earth millions of years ago, and watched as something vast and incomprehensible seeded the planet with the building blocks of life. She saw the rise and fall of countless species and the emergence of early humans, and she understood with crystal clarity that none of it had been random. Nathan gasped beside her as the same visions filled his mind. Lisa grabbed her head and dropped to one knee, overwhelmed by the influx of information. Claire remained standing, but tears streamed down her face as she witnessed the true history of humanity. When the visions finally stopped, Karen found herself on the floor breathing hard, trying to process what she had seen. Arya spoke again, and her words were simple, but their implications were devastating. Humanity's evolution had never been natural. Earth had been selected millions of years ago by an ancient intelligence as an experimental ground. Humans were designed to evolve in stages, and each transformation was triggered by reaching certain thresholds of technology and social development. Modern humans were only the 3rd stage in a planned sequence of 7 transformations, and the 4th transformation was coming soon, and it would change everything. Humanity thought they knew about themselves. Arya waited until the delegation had recovered from the vision before continuing, and Karen noticed that the future human's eyes held something like sympathy or perhaps regret. The holographic projections began again, but this time they were more controlled and less overwhelming. Images floated in the air showing DNA strands and evolutionary timelines and complex diagrams that Karen recognized as genetic sequencing data. The ancient intelligence that seeded Earth was called the Architects by Arya's people, and they existed in a form that current humanity could not fully comprehend. They were neither fully organic nor artificial, but something that merged consciousness with matter in ways that seemed impossible. The Architects had visited Earth when it was still young and planted the seeds of life with specific instructions coded into the very building blocks of existence. Kellen stepped forward and began explaining the technical details in a way that made Nathan lean in with intense focus. Every major evolutionary leap in Earth's history had been planned, and the genetic code of all living things contained hidden markers that activated at precise moments. When early fish developed the ability to breathe air and crawl onto land, it was not random mutation, but programmed instruction finally expressing itself. When primates began to walk upright and use tools, it was the next stage activating according to design. Nathan interrupted, and his voice was sharp with skepticism. He demanded proof because extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and he was not going to accept this story without verification. Kellen nodded as if he had expected this, and produced a device that looked like a simple tablet, but glowed with that same strange light as their clothing. He handed it to Nathan and showed him how to access genetic databases that compared human DNA with the patterns that Architects had left behind. Karen watched as Nathan's face went pale while he scrolled through the data. The so-called junk DNA that scientists had never understood suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of programmed evolution. Sections of genetic code that served no apparent purpose were actually instructions waiting to be activated. Nathan found markers in the human genome that corresponded exactly with the emergence of complex language and abstract thought and artistic expression. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Claire asked the question that everyone was thinking. Why tell humanity this now? And why travel back in time to deliver this message? Zane answered in a voice that was quieter than the others, but no less powerful. Humanity was approaching the fourth transformation threshold, and it would happen within the next 50 years. Based on current technological and social progress, unlike the previous transformations that had occurred gradually over thousands of years, the fourth would be rapid and violent, if humanity was not prepared. Paul had been silent until now, but he finally spoke up, asking what made the fourth transformation different from the others. Arya's expression darkened, and she gestured to create a new set of holographic images. These showed scenes of chaos and destruction, with cities burning and people screaming and society collapsing. The fourth transformation involved the merging of human consciousness with technology at a fundamental level, and it was not the simple brain computer interfaces that current scientists were developing, but a complete rewiring of neural pathways that would allow humans to interface directly with quantum realities. The transformation would not be optional, and it would not be gradual. When the threshold was reached, the architect code in human DNA would activate simultaneously. In every person on Earth, those whose bodies successfully adapted would emerge as something new, and those whose bodies rejected the change would die. In Arya's timeline, the unprepared transformation had killed 3 billion people in the span of just 6 months. The future humans had come back because they wanted to prevent that catastrophic death toll. Lisa immediately asked if the transformation could be stopped entirely. Arya shook her head and explained that the transformation was hardwired into human destiny by the architects, and removing it would require rewriting the fundamental genetic code that made humans what they were. It could not be prevented, but it could be prepared for, and that preparation would save billions of lives. Karen felt a cold weight settling in her stomach as she processed the implications. Humanity had always believed in free will and the power to choose their own destiny, but now they were being told that their entire evolutionary path had been predetermined. Every great achievement and every technological breakthrough had been part of a plan laid out millions of years ago. The sense of control that humans had over their lives was revealed to be an illusion. Nathan was still studying the genetic data. He made a discovery that made him look up sharply. He pointed to sections of the code that showed fail-safe mechanisms built into the architect design. If a species failed to meet certain benchmarks or deviated too far from the intended path, these fail-safes would trigger. Kellen confirmed what Nathan had found, and added that several mass extinctions in Earth's history had not been caused by asteroids or volcanic eruptions, but by fail-safe activations. When previous species failed to evolve, according to plan, the delegation sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the weight of what they were learning. Claire asked about the transformations beyond the fourth, and what humanity would become after passing through all 7 stages. Zane created projections showing the later transformations, and each one was more radical than the last. The 5th transformation would eliminate the need for physical bodies entirely, as humans learned to exist as patterns of consciousness. The 6th would allow manipulation of matter and energy at will. The 7th and final transformation would make humans into beings that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously with the power to reshape reality itself. Paul asked the obvious question that had been building in everyone's minds. What was the purpose of all this, and why had the architects created humanity to follow this path? Arya's expression became unreadable, and she exchanged glances with Kellen and Zane before answering. They did not know the full answer, because even in the year 4000 AD, the purpose of the architects remained a mystery. What they did know was that humanity was not unique, and the architects had seeded countless worlds with life following similar patterns. Karen stood up and walked closer to the holographic displays showing the genetic code. She studied the patterns and sequences with her physicist's mind, trying to find something that did not fit, or some clue about the architect's motivations. The code was elegant and beautiful in its complexity, and it showed a level of understanding about life and consciousness that current humanity could not match. Whoever or whatever the architects were, they possessed knowledge. That made human science look primitive. Nathan asked about the timeline and what specific signs would indicate the fourth transformation was beginning. Arya explained that the transformation would be triggered when humanity achieved certain technological milestones, combined with reaching a critical population density and level of global interconnection. The exponential growth of artificial intelligence and quantum computing were key indicators, and based on current trends, the threshold would be reached sometime between 2045 and 2055. The delegation realized they had less than 30 years to prepare the entire human race for a transformation that would fundamentally change what it meant to be human. Lisa asked what kind of preparation was needed and whether it was even possible to get 7 billion people ready for something like this. Kellen answered that the preparation involved both physical and mental conditioning, along with technological infrastructure that would help stabilize people during the transition. The future humans had brought detailed plans and the knowledge needed to build what was required, but implementation would depend entirely on whether current humanity could work together. Claire pointed out that getting all the nations of Earth to cooperate had always been nearly impossible, and this revelation would likely cause more division than unity. Arya acknowledged this was true and admitted that, in their timeline, the lack of preparation had been caused partly by humanity's inability to unite in the face of the threat. Different nations had hoarded knowledge and resources, and religious and political conflicts had prevented the coordinated response that could have saved billions. Karen asked if they could see more details about what the transformation actually felt like for individuals who went through it. Zane created a simulation that let them experience a tiny fraction of what the fourth transformation entailed. Even that small taste was overwhelming as Karen felt her consciousness expand and touch things beyond normal perception. For just a moment, she could sense the quantum field underlying reality and feel connections to every other living thing on Earth. When the simulation ended, she was gasping and her nose was bleeding from the neural strain. The future humans explained that without proper preparation, the shock of the transformation drove many people insane. Before their bodies could adapt, the preparation involved gradually expanding human neural capacity through careful training and genetic therapy. It also required building technology that could buffer the worst effects and guide people through the transition. All of this had to be done in less than 30 years, while also convincing humanity that the threat was real and that cooperation was essential. The future humans insisted that the revelation be broadcast to everyone on Earth simultaneously, and they would not accept any government's attempt to control or filter the information. Arya explained that in their timeline, the initial secrecy and misinformation had made everything worse, and this time, humanity needed to face the truth together. Within hours of the meeting at Svelbar, every television and radio and internet connection on the planet carried the same broadcast, showing the genetic evidence and the historical timeline and the projected transformation. Karen watched from the observation center as the world reacted, and it was like watching a dam break. News channels switched from their normal programming to emergency coverage, and reporters struggled to find words for what they were witnessing. Social media exploded with millions of posts every minute as people shared their shock and fear and disbelief. The future humans had provided a simple genetic test that anyone could perform using equipment found in high school science labs, and within days, thousands of independent researchers confirmed the presence of the architect code in human DNA. Religious institutions were the first to fracture under the weight of the revelation. Some church leaders declared the future humans as prophets sent by divine will to prepare humanity for ascension. Others condemned them as demons spreading lies to turn people away from faith. The Pope called for calm and reflection while acknowledging that the evidence could not be ignored. Mosques and temples and synagogues around the world held emergency gatherings where believers tried to reconcile their faith with the knowledge that human evolution had been designed by unknown entities. Nathan spent his days analyzing the genetic data and comparing it with samples from research institutions worldwide. Every test came back the same, showing the undeniable presence of dormant code that matched the architect patterns. He published his findings openly and invited other scientists to verify his work. Some colleagues embraced the discovery and began their own research, while others accused him of being part of an elaborate hoax. The scientific community split down the middle, with bitter arguments erupting at conferences and in academic journals. The political response was chaotic and dangerous. Some governments tried to seize control of the technology future humans had provided, hoping to gain advantage over rival nations. Russia and China immediately began secret programs to study the transformation process. The United States formed a special task force that included military and intelligence officials. Smaller nations banded together, demanding that the preparation technology be shared equally. The United Nations called emergency sessions, but the meetings devolved into shouting matches as delegates blamed each other for various conspiracies. Riots broke out in major cities as people struggled to process the implications of predetermined evolution. In New York, thousands marched through the streets, demanding answers from leaders who had none to give. In Mumbai, crowds gathered at government buildings, refusing to disperse until officials explained what would be done to prepare for the transformation. In London, protesters clashed with police who were just as confused and frightened as everyone else. The violence spread as fear turned into anger, and anger found targets in anyone who seemed to represent authority. Claire worked 18-hour days trying to establish a framework for global cooperation, but every attempt met resistance. Nations demanded guarantees that others would not weaponize the transformation technology. Religious leaders insisted that any preparation program respect their theological concerns. Corporate interests saw profit opportunities and lobbied for private control of key resources. The complexity of coordinating 7 billion people across hundreds of governments and thousands of cultures seemed impossible. Karen became obsessed with understanding the architects themselves, and she spent her nights in the vault, questioning Arya about every detail of the future timeline. The future humans had built their own theories about the architects based on 2,000 years of additional research and discovery. They believed the architects might be testing different evolutionary paths across multiple worlds to find the optimal design. Or perhaps they were preparing humanity for some greater purpose that would only become clear after the 7th transformation. Every answer led to more questions, and the fundamental mystery remained unsolved. Some people embraced the coming transformation with almost religious fervor. Cults formed around the worship of the architects, and their followers believed the transformation was a gift that would elevate humanity to godhood. They gathered in communes to practice meditation and mental exercises, hoping to prepare themselves spiritually. Some of these groups were peaceful, but others became dangerous, as charismatic leaders promised shortcuts to transformation that usually involved drugs or self-harm. Other groups rejected the entire concept and formed resistance, movements dedicated to fighting the predetermined path. They called themselves naturalists and argued that humanity should find a way to remove the architect code and evolve on their own terms. Their scientists worked on theoretical methods to rewrite human DNA without the embedded instructions. Their philosophers argued that, even if the transformation could not be stopped, humanity had a moral obligation to resist. Some naturalist factions turned violent, attacking research facilities and assassinating scientists who worked on transformation. Preparation Nathan made another disturbing discovery. While diving deeper into the genetic analysis, the architect code included monitoring mechanisms that tracked humanity's progress toward each transformation threshold. It was like having a computer program that reported back to its creator, and Nathan realized with horror that the architects might still be watching. They could be observing right now to see if this iteration of humanity would succeed or fail. The thought that human history was essentially a performance for unknown judges made him feel sick. Paul returned to the space station and spent his time observing the future human ship, which remained in orbit. He noticed that sometimes other vessels appeared briefly near the main ship before vanishing again. When he reported this to Arya, she explained that the future humans had established a temporary base in Earth's past and ships were traveling back and forth bringing supplies and personnel. The technology required to maintain stable time travel was enormous, and they could only keep the portal open for a limited period. Karen asked how long the future humans could stay, and Arya's answer was troubling. They had approximately 6 months before the energy requirements became too great, and they would need to return to their own time. 6 months to convince humanity to prepare for a transformation that was decades away. 6 months to overcome thousands of years of division and conflict. 6 months to change the course of human history or watch billions die when the unprepared transformation began. Social fabric of civilization continued to tear as people chose sides in debates about how to respond. Families split when parents and children disagreed about whether to embrace or resist the transformation. Friendships ended over arguments about the architect's intentions. Communities fractured along lines of belief and fear. The very thing that was supposed to unite humanity in common purpose was instead driving them further apart. Lisa compiled reports from military intelligence sources around the world, and the picture was grim. At least 15 nations were developing weapons programs based on transformation technology, hoping to create super soldiers. Black market dealers sold fake genetic therapies, claiming to prepare people for the change. Criminal organizations exploited the chaos to expand their operations. The breakdown of social order was accelerating, and if something did not change soon, the violence would escalate beyond control. Claire finally managed to organize a global summit bringing together representatives from every nation, along with religious leaders and scientists and activists from all perspectives. The summit was held in Geneva, and security was unprecedented, with thousands of troops guarding the venue. The future humans agreed to attend and present their complete plan for preparing humanity. It was perhaps the last chance to forge unity. Before the world descended into complete chaos, Karen traveled to Geneva. Feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being one of the few people who had direct access to the future humans, she understood the science better than most and had spent more time with Arya learning the details of what was coming. As she entered the massive conference hall and saw the thousands of delegates waiting, she realized that the next few days would determine whether humanity faced the fourth transformation as a unified species or as scattered tribes fighting among themselves. The architects had designed the transformation, but humanity still had to choose how they would meet it. Geneva Summit had been underway for 3 days when Arya requested an emergency session with all delegates present, and her tone carried an urgency that had not been there before. Karen sat in the front row next to Nathan and Claire and Lisa as thousands of representatives from every corner of Earth filled the massive hall. The future humans appeared on the central stage, and even through the holographic projection, their presence commanded absolute attention, and the room fell silent. Arya began by explaining that the future humans had been debating among themselves since their arrival, and the debate had been intense and filled with ethical concerns that went to the core of what they were trying to accomplish. Zane and Kellen stood on either side of her, and their expressions were grave. They had decided to offer present-day humanity a choice that had never existed in their timeline, and the weight of this decision had clearly troubled them deeply. Zane stepped forward, and the holographic displays showed complex genetic sequences and mathematical models. The future humans had developed a method to pause the transformation process, and this would buy humanity additional centuries to prepare instead of the mere 30 years they currently had. The technology existed and had been tested, and it would work. But as Zane continued speaking, the mood in the hall shifted from hope to horror as he explained the cost. The architect code was deeply integrated with human biology at the most fundamental level, and pausing it required genetic modification that would have permanent effects on the human species. People who received the modification would see their natural lifespan cut in half, and the average human would live only 40 years instead of 80. More devastating was the effect on human creativity and innovation, because the modification would eliminate certain neural pathways that allowed for abstract thinking and artistic expression and breakthrough discoveries. Humanity would trade its potential for time. The hall erupted in chaos as delegates shouted questions and objections and demands for clarification. Lisa stood up, and her military bearing cut through the noise as she argued that humanity needed time to unite and prepare properly. She pointed out that 30 years was nothing. When measured against the scale of what was being asked, in an extra few centuries could mean the difference between success and extinction. Better to be a lesser humanity that survived than a greater humanity that destroyed itself, Nathan countered immediately, and his voice shook with emotion. He argued that diminishing human capability defeated the entire purpose, because how could a lesser humanity possibly prepare for a transformation designed for their current form? The modification would create a humanity that was fundamentally broken and unable to reach the heights necessary for successful transformation. They would be buying time, but losing the ability to use that time effectively. It was a trap disguised as an option. Claire tried to mediate between the opposing views, but found herself torn by the impossible nature of the choice. She understood Lisa's argument about needing unity and coordination, but she also saw Nathan's point about the futility of preparation without capability. The delegates began forming camps around different positions, and the fragile unity that had been building over the past 3 days shattered completely. Karen sat quietly through the inertia. LKOs because something about the offer troubled her deeply, and she could not quite identify what it was. She watched Arya's face and saw something there that did not match the words being spoken. The future humans were offering this choice, but they did not seem relieved or hopeful about it. Instead, they appeared almost expectant, as if waiting for something specific to happen. Karen stood and asked for permission to speak. Directly to Arya, and the hall quieted as people sensed her concern. She asked Arya why the future humans would offer this choice if they had already lived through a successful transformation in their own timeline. If the transformation worked and created the evolved humanity standing before them now, then why provide an option to avoid it? Arya's expression shifted, and for a moment something like pride flickered in her eyes. She gestured for Karen to join her on the stage, and the physicist climbed the steps, feeling the eyes of the world upon her. Arya explained that Karen had asked the right question, and it deserved an honest answer, even though that answer would complicate everything further. The transformation in the future humans' timeline had been successful, and they had evolved through all 7 stages and achieved mastery over consciousness and reality itself. But in reaching the 7th stage, they had discovered a truth that changed everything they understood about existence and purpose and choice. Kellen activated a new set of projections that showed patterns repeating across time and space. The architects were not external beings from another world or dimension, but were actually previous iterations of humanity from a cycle that had repeated countless times across different universes and timelines. Each time humanity evolved through 7 stages and reached godlike power, they used that power to travel back to the beginning of time and seed new versions of Earth with the code for their own creation. The entire process was a closed loop with humanity, creating the conditions for its own existence. The revelation hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow, and Karen felt her mind reeling from the implications. The architects were not mysterious aliens conducting experiments, but were humanity itself engaged in an eternal act of self-creation. Every transformation and every struggle and every achievement was part of a predetermined cycle that had no beginning and no end. Free will was not just limited, but was potentially an illusion created by beings who were trapped in an infinite loop of their own making. Arya continued, and her voice carried a weight of existential exhaustion. The future humans had grown tired of the cycle after discovering the truth. They wanted to know if humanity could break free, and if there was a possibility of existence outside the predetermined loop. By offering the pause, they were introducing a variable that had never existed before in any iteration. They hoped it would create a divergent timeline that escaped the cycle entirely. Nathan stood again, and his face was red with anger. He accused the future humans of using present-day humanity as test subjects in their own experiment, and he was not entirely wrong. The future humans were gambling with the entire species to satisfy their existential crisis. The choice was not really about preparation versus transformation, but about accepting a predetermined destiny or risking extinction for the possibility of genuine free will. The delegates began arguing again, but this time the debate had shifted. Some argued that even a slim chance at free will was worth any risk. Others insisted that survival within the cycle was better than potential extinction outside it. Religious leaders grappled with the theological implications of humanity being both creator and created. Scientists tried to analyze the logic of closed time loops and divergent timelines. The complexity of the situation exceeded anything human civilization had faced before. Karen asked Arya directly what the future humans truly wanted present-day humanity to do. Arya's answer was both honest and frustrating, because she said they genuinely did not know. They had provided information and options, but the choice had to be humanity's own, or it would not accomplish the goal of breaking the cycle. If the future humans influenced the decision too heavily, then it would just be another predetermined outcome. The paradox was maddening, because humanity was being asked to choose freely while knowing that their choice might itself be part of the pattern. Paul spoke up from his position in the military section and asked, what would happen if humanity chose neither option? What if they rejected both the rapid transformation and the pause, and instead dedicated themselves to finding a third way? Arya's expression became unreadable, and she exchanged long looks with Kellen and Zane before responding. She said that a third option was theoretically possible, but would be the most difficult path imaginable. Lisa asked for details, and Zane explained that humanity could attempt to research the architect code while simultaneously preparing for the transformation using the time they had. It would require unprecedented global cooperation and massive resource allocation, and there would be no guarantee of success. The fourth transformation would hit before they were ready, and millions or billions might still die. But it would be humanity's own choice made without following either the predetermined path or the escape route offered by their future selves. Claire saw an opportunity in this suggestion and began organizing delegates into working groups to explore the feasibility of a third option. Nathan threw himself into analyzing the genetic code, looking for any hidden mechanisms or escape conditions that might exist. Karen worked with Arya to access more detailed records from the year 4000, searching for clues that previous humanities might have missed. The summit that was supposed to end in 3 days extended indefinitely as humanity grappled with choosing its own fate. The debate raged for weeks as experts from every field contributed analysis and proposals. The global media covered every development, and ordinary people around the world discussed the choice in homes and workplaces and public forums. Humanity had been handed its destiny and told to decide, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing. Some people wanted to accept the transformation and trust in the architect design. Others wanted to take the pause and buy more time. Still others supported the attempt to find a third way, even knowing the risks involved. Karen barely slept as she worked around the clock studying the genetic code and the historical records. She began to notice patterns that the future humans had either missed or not fully explored. There were layers within the architect code that resembled comments in computer programming, and these metadata fragments suggested that the cycle was not meant to be eternal. There appeared to be an exit condition built into the seventh transformation, but no humanity had ever discovered it because they had always followed the predetermined path exactly. Karen's discovery of the hidden exit condition changed everything about the debate, and she presented her findings to the full assembly with trembling hands. The metadata embedded in the architect code suggested that someone or something had intentionally designed an escape from the cycle, but it could only be accessed by a humanity that deviated from the predetermined path. Every previous iteration had followed the exact same evolutionary trajectory and therefore never discovered the exit. The future humans themselves had missed it because they had been looking at the code as recipients rather than as potential escapees. Nathan verified Karen's analysis and found additional supporting evidence in genetic sequences that seemed to serve no purpose within the cycle, but might activate under different conditions. The code was like a lock waiting for a key that could only be forged by a humanity that chose its own path, instead of following the architect design. The implications were staggering because it meant the entire cycle might be a test to see if any iteration of humanity would eventually choose independence over obedience. Claire immediately proposed a third option that incorporated Karen's discovery, and within hours, a formal proposal was drafted. Humanity would reject both the transformation timeline and the pause option, and instead dedicate all resources to finding and activating the exit condition. It would be dangerous and unprecedented, and likely to fail, but it would be entirely humanity's choice. The proposal was distributed to every nation, an organization, and individual who wanted to review it. The future humans responded to Karen's discovery with something that looked like joy mixed with relief. Arya admitted that this possibility was exactly what they had hoped for when they decided to come back in time. They had not been certain that present-day humanity would think beyond the binary options offered, but the fact that Karen had found what they themselves had missed proved that an earlier iteration could see things differently. The future humans had not come to save present-day humanity, but to test whether they could save themselves. Paul organized a global referendum to let every person on Earth vote on humanity's future, and the logistics were enormous but possible with modern technology. Every human above the age of 16 would have the opportunity to choose between three options: accept the transformation path and face the fourth stage in 30 years, accept the genetic modification pause that would reduce capability but buy time, or reject both and pursue the third way of finding the exit condition while preparing for an unprepared transformation. The campaign period lasted 3 months, and during that time, humanity engaged in the most intense global conversation in its history. Debates happened in every language and culture and context. Families gathered around dinner tables to discuss which path offered the best chance for survival. Scientists published papers analyzing the risks and benefits of each option. Religious leaders offered guidance based on their understanding of divine will or cosmic purpose. Artists created works exploring what it meant to choose your own destiny versus following a designed path. Lisa threw her support behind the third option and used her military connections to build a coalition of defense forces from multiple nations. She argued that accepting either predetermined option was surrender, and that humanity's greatest strength had always been its stubborn refusal to accept limitations. The military perspective resonated with many people who valued independence and self-determination above safety and certainty. Nathan became the scientific voice for the third option, and he traveled, constantly giving lectures and interviews explaining the evidence for the exit condition. He acknowledged the risks openly and never promised success, but he made a compelling case that the attempt itself was worthwhile. His passion and honesty won over many skeptics who had initially favored the safer options. Claire worked with international organizations to develop the infrastructure needed if the third option won. Coordination networks were established to share research findings instantly across all nations. Resource allocation plans were created to ensure every country could contribute to the effort. Conflict resolution mechanisms were designed to prevent the cooperation from breaking down. The preparation for the third option became a model of what unified humanity could accomplish. Karen spent the campaign period continuing to analyze the architect code, and she found more clues hidden in the deepest layers of the genetic programming. The exit conditions seemed to be triggered by genuine unpredictability in human choice and behavior. As long as humanity followed patterns that could be predicted by the architects, the cycle would continue. But if humanity became truly random and self-directed in ways that could not be anticipated, then the exit would open. It was as if the architects had hoped that eventually one iteration would surprise them. The voting took place over a 48-hour period, and the turnout was unprecedented, with over 90% of eligible humans casting ballots. Karen watched the results come in from the observation center where she had first detected the future human ship months ago. The numbers were close and shifted constantly as different regions reported their totals. Paul monitored from the space station while Nathan and Claire watched from Geneva, and Lisa tracked results from military command centers. When the final counts were verified, the results showed that 43% had voted for accepting the transformation path, 31% had voted for the pause option, 26% had voted for the third option of finding the exit condition. No option had achieved a majority, and according to the referendum rules, that meant no binding decision had been reached. Humanity remained divided and unable to choose its fate through democratic consensus. The initial reaction was disappointment and frustration as people realized that months of debate and campaigning had not produced a clear answer. Some called for a second referendum with only the top two options. Others argued that the lack of majority meant humanity should default to the predetermined transformation path. Still others claimed that the division itself was the answer, and that no single path should be forced on everyone. Arya appeared at an emergency session in Geneva, and her message surprised everyone. She explained that in every previous timeline, humanity had been united in following the predetermined path because they had never questioned it deeply enough to see alternatives. The division and the inability to reach consensus represented the first real deviation from the architect pattern. For the first time in the eternal cycle, humanity had achieved something the architects had not planned for, which was genuine unpredictability. Zane added that the referendum results were actually more significant than any decisive vote would have been. A unified choice might still be following a predetermined pattern, even if it seemed like free will. But a species so divided that it could not agree on its own future was exhibiting true chaos and randomness. The architects had designed the transformation to activate when humanity reached certain clear thresholds, but now those thresholds had become uncertain because humanity itself was uncertain. Kellen revealed that the future humans would be returning to their own time within days because the energy requirements had reached critical levels. Before leaving, they would provide all their knowledge and technology to present-day humanity with no restrictions or conditions. They would share everything they had learned about the transformations and the architect code and the history of future development. What present-day humanity did with that information would be entirely up to them. The future humans made one final broadcast. To all of Earth, and Arya spoke with a tone that mixed hope and uncertainty. She explained that they did not know what would happen next because the timeline had become genuinely unpredictable for the first time. The division within humanity and the discovery of the exit condition and the choice to choose had all introduced variables that had never existed before. History was no longer following a predetermined script. Karen stood with Nathan and Paul and Claire and Lisa, watching as the future human vessel prepared to depart. The ship glowed with increasing intensity as it gathered energy for the return journey through time. Arya sent a final private message to Karen, thanking her for asking the right questions and for refusing to accept simple answers. The physicist who had first detected the impossible ship months ago had become the catalyst for breaking the eternal cycle. As the vessel vanished in a flash of light that briefly outshone the sun, Karen felt the weight of responsibility settle over her and everyone around her. The future was now truly unknown, and humanity would face the fourth transformation in roughly 30 years without any guarantee of survival. But they would face it as themselves, making their own choices and writing their own story rather than following someone else's design. Nathan returned to his laboratory and immediately noticed something impossible happening in his genetic samples. The architect code in human DNA was changing on its own and not following any predetermined pattern, but responding to humanity's choice to choose. The code was evolving and adapting to the concept of free will as if it had been waiting for millions of years for someone to finally question the design. He called Karen and showed her the data, and together they realized that the exit condition was already beginning to activate. The world began to change in subtle ways as the architect code responded to humanity's unpredictability. People reported dreams of futures that did not match any timeline from the architect design. Artists created works that expressed concepts outside normal human perception. Scientists made discoveries that should have been impossible based on current knowledge. The transformation had not arrived yet, but something was already transforming. And it was happening because humanity had chosen to be unpredictable. Claire established a global network called UNDUZLO, the Open Path Initiative that brought together people from every nation and culture to coordinate preparation for the unknown future. Instead of following the future humans' plans, the initiative encouraged experimentation and innovation and deviation from expected patterns. The goal was to become so unpredictable that the architect's cycle could not reassert control, even if it tried. Lisa transformed military organizations into research and development forces dedicated to exploring the boundaries of human potential. Instead of preparing for war, they prepared for transformation by pushing every limit and testing every assumption. Soldiers became explorers of consciousness, and veterans of combat became pioneers of evolution. Paul coordinated the space-based observation network to watch for any signs of the architects or other temporal anomalies. The future humans had left behind detection equipment that could sense disturbances in time and space. If the architects tried to reset the cycle, or if other iterations of humanity appeared, the network would provide early warning. Karen continued studying the genetic code and watching as it transformed itself in response to human unpredictability. She published her findings openly and encouraged everyone to examine their own DNA and witness the changes happening in real time. The architect design was breaking down and rebuilding itself into something new, and the process was being driven by humanity's refusal to follow the script. The fourth transformation was still coming, and no one knew how many would survive or what humanity would become. But for the first time in an eternal cycle of predetermined evolution, humanity was writing its own code and making its own choices and becoming truly unpredictable. The experiment had become the experimenter, and the creation had challenged the creator, and the story of where humanity would go from here belonged to no one but themselves.